Elvis opened the door with a heavy sigh, putting his keys on the small table by the entrance. The house was unusually quiet. It felt wrong. He paused, listening for the familiar sounds of his children playing or the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, but there was nothing. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the place. He walked through the hallway, tapping his shoes against the wooden floor as he turned the corner into the living room. He stopped suddenly, his heart racing. Marie was in the middle of the room, her back to him, frantically shoving clothes into a large suitcase. The sight was so jarring that for a moment he wondered if he was dreaming. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice sharp with confusion. Maria didn't even flinch. She kept packing, her movements frantic and almost mechanical. "I'm done," she said, her voice cold and detached. "I'm sick of living paycheck to paycheck with you. I found someone. It'd be better with someone who has 12 in, not like your boring little 4 in, and he's younger and filthy rich. Unlike you." Elvis felt as if the floor had just dropped out from under him. "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, trying to catch her eye, but she avoided his gaze, focusing instead on folding a dress with deliberate care. "What about the kids? What about our family?" His voice cracked as he spoke, desperation creeping in. Maria looked up. Her eyes were hard and unfeeling. "It's simple, Elvis. You're the father. You keep them. I want to enjoy my life. I'm done playing house with you." Elvis opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of a powerful engine rumbled from outside. He turned toward the window just in time to see a sleek black SUV pull into the driveway. The door swung open, and out stepped a man who looked like he had walked straight out of a magazine. Tall, the man was dressed to the nines, with a smirk on his face, and he strolled up to the front door. He pushed it open and walked in. "Hey there," he said, looking Elvis up and down with a sneer. "She's mine now and you can keep the kids. We don't want those little monsters." Elvis's heart sank. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before him. "Maria, are you serious?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could answer, there was a sudden patter of small feet, and their 8-year-old daughter, Rose, their daughter, came into the room looking confused and scared. She looked from her mom to the stranger in their house and asked, "Mummy, what's happening? Where are you going?" Maria just gave her a quick look and said, "I'm leaving, Rose. You're staying." Rose's eyes filled with tears as she ran to her mother, grabbing onto her leg. "Mummy, please don't go," she pleaded. "Please, let go, Rose," Maria said, pulling her leg away almost in disgust. "I have to go," Jake said, their 15-year-old son. Jake appeared in the doorway, his face pale and eyes red from holding back tears. He said, "Mom, please don't do this. We need you. We're a family. You can't just leave us." Maria's expression didn't change. She reached for another blouse to pack. "You be fine, Jake. You have your father. I need to think about myself for once." Elvis watched his children crumble before him. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. He felt angry. He felt a surge of emotion, but he fought to keep his voice steady. "Maria, if you leave with this man, don't think you can come back when the fantasy fades. You're not welcome here ever again, and the kids will hate you forever." Maria paused for a moment, the dress she was holding in her hands. Then the man behind her cleared his throat, and her resolve hardened. She zipped up the suitcase, closed it with a snap, and turned to face him. "Elvis, this is your problem now," she said, her tone flat as though she was discussing the weather. She grabbed the suitcase handle and walked past Elvis without a backward glance. Her lover was close behind, and the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the now eerily quiet house. Elvis stood there motionless, his mind numb. It wasn't until Rose's quiet sobs broke the silence that he finally moved. He knelt down, pulling his daughter into his arms. "Okay, sweetheart, we'll get through this," he said, though the words felt empty. Jake stood at the doorway, his fists clenched at his sides, his jaw set in a hard line. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Elvis looked up at his son, the weight of their new reality settling heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to say something that would make it all better, but the truth was he didn't have an answer. All he could do was hold. He held his daughter close and hoped that somehow they would find a way to move forward. The sound of the SUV's engine roared to life outside, and V's chest tightened as he heard the tires crunch against the gravel, carrying Maria and her new lover away from them. He stood up slowly, took a deep breath, and turned to his children. "We're going to get through this," he said, more to himself than to them. "Or we have to." Jake nodded, his eyes hard with determination. "We don't need her," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We'll be okay, Dad." Elvis forced a smile, ruffling his son's hair. "Yeah, we will, but for now, let's just focus on getting through tonight." He led them into the kitchen where he began to prepare dinner. The routine actions helped to steady his nerves, and he tried to focus on the task at hand. But as he looked over at his children sitting quietly at the table, the weight of what the whole thing had just happened, like a lead blanket. They ate in silence, with only the sound of clinking silverware to break the stillness. Elvis couldn't shake the image of Maria walking out the door, or banish the echo of her cold words from his mind. When dinner was over, he sent the kids to bed with a promise that they would talk more in the morning. He sat at the table long after the dishes were cleared, staring blankly at the wall. The house felt emptier than ever, as if Maria had taken more than just her things when she left. Eventually, he got up from the table, moving slowly and deliberately, and made his way to his bedroom. The bed felt too big, and the silence too loud. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, replaying the events of the evening over and over in his mind. Maria's departure had left him reeling. Elvis felt like he was walking through a fog. It was hard for Elvis to grasp the reality of the situation. Every corner of the house was a reminder of the life that had been shattered. Roses abandoned, toys left behind, Jake's forgotten soccer cleats, the half-empty closet in the bedroom. Each of these reminders weighed heavily on Elvis's mind as he tried to figure out how to move forward. Morning after morning, he forced himself to get out of bed, driven by a sense of duty. The kids needed him now more than ever, and he couldn't afford to crumble. Every day felt like a struggle against a relentless tide of despair. Rose was the first to show signs of the tea Maria's departure had taken. She had always been a sensitive child, but now her sadness ran deeper than ever before. Every night, Elvis would hear her muffled sobs through the thin walls of the house. "Where's Mommy? Why doesn't she want to be here with us?" she would ask him, her voice small and fragile, as he tucked her into bed. Each time he had to answer, Elvis's heart broke. "Mommy's gone for now, sweetie, but I'm here and I always will be. We'll be okay, I promise." He would stroke her hair, trying to soothe her, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes as the days turned into weeks. Rose's once bright smile faded, replaced by a constant look of confusion and sadness. She clung to Elvis more than ever. Rose was always afraid to let him out of her sight, as if she feared he might disappear too. Jake, on the other hand, reacted with anger. His frustration was like a fire that he couldn't put out, and it consumed him. He started skipping meals, locking himself in his room and refusing to talk to anyone. When he did come out, it was usually the last out. He'd slam doors, shout at his sister, or argue with Elvis over the smallest things. "Why the hell did she leave us, Dad? What did we do wrong?" he would shout. His fists clenched tight as if he wanted to hit something, anything, to make the pain go away. Elvis could see the pain behind Jake's anger, the hurt that his son was trying so hard to hide. He tried to talk to Jake, but every conversation ended in a shouting match. "It's not your fault, Jake," Elvis would say, trying to reach his son, but Jake wasn't ready to hear it. "She doesn't care about us, Dad. She left because one evening," Jake said, "she didn't care about our family." He stormed out of the room before Elvis could say anything more. Elvis was left standing there, feeling helpless and aching for his son. He realized he had to do more than just wait for time to heal their wounds. He needed to show Jake and Rose that they could still be a family, even if things would never be the same again. He threw himself into. He took on the roles of both mother and father with renewed determination. He started getting up earlier, preparing breakfast for them before they left for school, and making sure to be there when they got home. He found himself attending every parent-teacher conference and every school event, even the ones Maria used to take care of. He was there for every soccer game, every school play, and every moment that mattered to his kids. At the same time, he was driven by a burning desire for revenge. Elvis was still nursing a grudge. He couldn't get Maria's departure out of his mind. Her lover had walked out with the kids, leaving him high and dry. He was still seething, but he kept it to himself, focusing on being there for his. Instead of focusing on his own kids, he thought about how they'd feel when they grew up and saw what he'd done. He gripped the steering wheel as he drove to work, thinking about how they couldn't just walk away and expect no consequences. One evening, after another tense dinner where Jake barely spoke, Elvis decided it was time to address the elephant in the room. When they'd finished eating, Elvis looked across the table at his son, who was poking at the remnants of his meal. "Jake, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but firm. His words were carefully chosen, but we're still a family. "Jake, we need to stick together." Jake dropped his fork onto his plate with a clatter. "Dad, how are we supposed to be a family when she just left us like that? We're nothing to her." Elvis leaned forward and met Jake's eyes. "I don't have all the answers, Jake. I wish I did. I did, but I know one thing. We're not nothing. We have each other, and that's something. It's everything." Jake looked away, his jaw tight. "It's not the same, Dad. It never will be." "No, it won't," Elvis agreed, his voice heavy with truth. "But that doesn't mean we give up. We can't control what she did, but we can control how we move forward. Let's move forward together, Jake. We'll get through this. It's been weeks since we've been able to do this." Jake's tough exterior cracked just a little. He didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Elvis took that as a small victory after dinner. Jake retreated to his room, and Rose curled up on the couch with her favorite stuffed animal. Elvis sat down in the living room and stared out of the window at the darkening night. He was still hurting, but he was determined to be strong for his kids. He couldn't let revenge take over, or it would only make things worse. Elvis knew he needed to be careful and think things through. He didn't want to do something reckless that would hurt his kids even more. He couldn't let Maria and her lover get away with what they had done. He'd make sure they paid for this. In the days that followed, Elvis's resolve only grew stronger. He began to lay the groundwork for what he knew would be a long and meticulous process. He couldn't rush this. He needed to be patient and wait for the right moment. In the meantime, he would focus on his children and rebuild their lives. He would also make sure they knew they were loved and cared for. They knew they were loved and cared for, but Elvis knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was yet to come, and when it did, he would be ready. He would show Maria and her lover that they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Months passed, and the pain of betrayal dulled into a persistent ache that Elvis could never fully shake. Elvis was still dealing with the pain of betrayal, but he was trying to move on with his life. His children were adjusting to their new circumstances, but they still had some emotional scars from their mother's abandonment. Rose had stopped asking about her mother as often, but she still looked sad. Jake was never fully over it. He was still angry, but he'd become more guarded and cynical. Elvis saw it all and felt a burning sense of injustice. He knew he couldn't just let Maria and Greg walk away from what they'd done. They had to face the consequences. Elvis was always a methodical man. He approached his work and his responsibilities in the same way. He approached his work with the same calculated precision he started with, gathering information. Elvis knew he couldn't go into this blindly if he was going to make them pay. He needed to know everything about their new lives, so he hired a private investigator, someone discreet and thorough. To get to the bottom of Maria and Greg's lives, Elvis hired a retired cop named Moray, who had a talent for uncovering secrets. "Elvis, you're going to want to sit down for this," Moray said, handing Elvis a thick envelope filled with reports and photographs. They were sitting in a dimly lit corner of a bar, far from prying eyes. Elvis opened the envelope and started looking through it. The more he read, the tighter his grip on the papers became. Greg wasn't as successful as he seemed. His wealth was built on shaky deals, fraudulent schemes, and connections to unsavory characters. The photos showed Greg at meetings with men who looked more like enforcers than businessmen. There were pictures of him entering and leaving buildings that Elvis recognized from news reports about criminal investigations. Murray explained that Greg's whole empire was a scam. He'd been skimming money off his own companies and laundering it. It's all through shell corporations, and it's only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. But it gets worse. Your wife is involved too. She's been spending money like it's going out of style, but it's all dirty. If this goes south, she's going down with him. Elvis felt a grim satisfaction brewing in his chest. Maria had left him and their children for a fantasy, a dream of a life filled with luxury and ease. But that dream was about to become a nightmare, thanks to more eyes. Elvis said, standing up, "I'll take it from here." Armed with this information, Elvis began to execute his plan. He knew he couldn't take down Greg directly. He needed to be smart and subtle. The first step was to plant seeds of doubt in Greg's business relationships. Elvis started sending anonymous tips to Greg's clients and investors, pointing out irregularities in his business practices. He did it carefully, making sure the tips came from different sources so they couldn't be traced back to him. It didn't take long for the effects to show. Greg's investors started pulling out of deals that had been in the pipeline for months. Rumors spread like wildfire through the business community, and soon Greg's empire started to crumble. Elvis watched it all unfold. From a distance, Elvis felt a cold sense of vindication, while Greg's life unraveled. He threw himself into his work with renewed energy, staying late at the office, taking on new projects and making connections that would elevate his career. His efforts paid off. He earned a promotion, and with it came a significant rise in salary. But it wasn't just about the money. Elvis wanted to prove to himself and to his children that they could rise above the betrayal. He wanted Maria to see the man he had become, successful, respected, and stronger than ever. As Elvis's professional life flourished, he also began for a long time. He'd shut himself off from the idea of love. He was too hurt and too focused on his kids to consider starting over. But as the months passed, he realized that he didn't want to spend the rest of his life alone. He deserved happiness just as much as his children did. It was at a company event that Elvis met Lisa. She was a colleague from another department. She was smart, kind, and had a warm smile that melted the ice around his heart. They started talking first casually, then more frequently. They went from discussing work to sharing stories about their lives. Lisa was a single mother, and she understood the struggles Elvis had been through. There was no need to explain the pain of betrayal. She had lived through her own share of hardships. One night after a particularly long conversation over dinner, Elvis realized that he was falling for her. At first he was scared. He'd been through a lot and he was nervous about opening up again. Lisa made it easy. She was patient, understanding, and most importantly, she cared for him and his children genuinely. When Elvis finally introduced Lisa to Jake and Rose, he was nervous. He had no idea how they would react, but to his relief, they took to her almost immediately. From the start, Lisa wasn't trying to replace their mother. She just wanted to be there for them. She listened to Rose's stories, helped Jake with his homework, and soon her presence brought a warmth back into the house that had been missing for so long. You could feel the transformation in the household. Laughter began to fill the rooms again. The rooms were filled again, and the tension that had once been constant started to dissipate. Elvis couldn't help but feel that things were finally moving in the right direction. But he knew his plan wasn't complete yet. The final piece was making sure that Maria realized exactly what she had lost as Greg's empire continued to grow. Maria's world was falling apart. Elvis heard through mutual acquaintances that she had begun to panic. She had traded her family for a luxury lifestyle, and now it was slipping through her fingers. Greg was becoming distant, and their relationship was strained by the mounting pressure of their Maria was in a bad way financially, and it wasn't long before Elvis got the news he'd been waiting for. Greg had left her, broke and with nowhere to go. Maria had finally hit rock bottom, but Elvis wasn't done yet. He made sure that word got back to her about his success and the life he'd built without her. He wanted her to know. He told her that he and the kids were doing well, that they had moved on, and that she was the one who had been left behind. One day, as Elvis was sitting in his office, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Maria asking to meet. He stared at the message for a long time before replying and agreed to meet. But he already knew how it would end when they finally met. Elvis could barely recognize her. The confident, glamorous woman who had walked out on him months ago was gone. In her place was someone who looked tired and desperate. She tried to apologize and explain herself, but Elvis didn't need to hear it. He had already. "I'm not here to talk about the past. I'm here to tell you that it's over. I've rebuilt my life and found someone who truly cares about me and the kids. You made your choice, Maria, and now you have to live with it." As he walked away from the meeting, Elvis felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had done what he needed to do, not just for himself, but for his children. They had been through a lot, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Now they could finally put the past behind them and look forward to a brighter future. As Elvis's life blossomed with newfound happiness and success, Maria's world quickly fell apart. The man she'd left her family for, Greg, had become a stranger. He was distant, resentful, and increasingly hostile as his business empire crumbled around him. The luxury SUV that had once symbolized her upgraded life was repossessed. The expensive clothes she'd once flaunted were now reminders. Every day she felt the reality of her situation closing in on her. The illusion she had once clung to was slowly being squeezed out. It started with the little things. Dinners that had once been enjoyed at the city's finest restaurants became takeout from the cheapest places they could find. Weekend getaways turned into long nights at home where Greg would drink silently, staring at the television without saying a word to her. Then the creditors started calling. Greg would answer the phone, his face contorting with anger, shouting about deals gone wrong and investors pulling out. Maria would retreat to the bedroom clutching a pillow, hoping that this nightmare would end, but it only got worse. One evening, the tension finally snapped. Greg stormed into their apartment, his face twisted with fury. "This is all your fault," he shouted, throwing his jacket onto the floor. "Ever since you came into my life, everything's gone to. I should have never." Maria, who had been sitting on the couch, looked up in shock. "What are you talking about, Greg? We're in this together, right?" Greg sneered. "You were just a fun distraction, a toy. Now you're nothing but bad luck. Everything I touch turns to dust." Greg's voice rose with every word, and Maria felt the sting of his accusation like a slap across the face. "Greg, please," she pleaded, standing up to face him. "We can work through this. We can't." "Shut up," he cut her off, shaking his head. "I'm done. I'm done with you in this mess. I found someone. I'm leaving Maria. You're on your own with that." Greg turned on his heel and began packing his things. She'd given up hope, but as she watched him throw his belongings into a suitcase, it hit her. The man she'd left her family for, the man who'd promised her a life of luxury and happiness, was walking out the door without a second thought. "Greg, please don't do this," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I have nowhere else to go, please." But Greg ignored her, zipped up his suitcase and headed for the door. "You'll figure something out," he muttered, not even bothering to look at her as he walked out the door and slammed it shut behind him, leaving Maria alone in the now emptied apartment. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She had lost everything in the days that followed. Maria's life spiraled further into despair. She tried to reach out to friends, but they didn't answer her calls. She had burned too many bridges and was now paying the price. The apartment, which had once been a symbol of her new life, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her with the weight of her mistakes. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, Maria made a decision that she had once thought impossible. She would go back to Elvis and the family she had abandoned. Surely they would take her back. She had nowhere else to turn. After all, they were her children. She couldn't be turned away. She would apologize and beg for forgiveness. Perhaps she could reclaim some of the life she had thrown away. Maria knocked on the door of the house she had once called home. The sound echoed in the quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was a constant reminder of what she had lost after what felt like an eternity. The door opened, but it wasn't Elvis who stood there. It was a woman with a warm smile and kind eyes who looked at Maria with a mixture of curiosity and pity. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Maria's heart sank. Maria knew who this woman was. She was Elvis's new partner, the woman who had taken her place. "I need to speak to Elvis," Maria stammered, her voice cracking. "Please, it's important," the woman said, stepping aside. "Come in," she said, her tone still kind. Maria entered the house, her eyes darting around the living room. The room was full of photos of Elvis, the kids, and this woman. They all looked happy and content, which was a stark contrast to Maria's life. It was like stepping into a life that had moved on without her. Elvis appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as he took in the sight of Maria standing in his home. "Maria, what do you want?" His voice was cold and distant. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she fell to her knees. "I made a mistake, Elvis. Please forgive me. Let me come back. I miss you and the kids. I was wrong." At night, he'd stayed up comforting Rose. He'd seen the anger in Jake's eyes and heard Maria laugh at him as she walked out the door. "You made your choice, Maria. You wanted a life without us, and now you have it. You're not welcome here anymore." Maria's sobs filled the room, but Elvis's he'd made up his mind. He'd moved on and rebuilt his life without her. He wasn't going to let her back in. Lisa stepped forward and placed a hand gently on Maria's shoulder. "It's time to go," she said softly. Maria looked up, her vision blurred with tears. She saw the life she'd once taken for granted, the warmth, the love. As she was led out of the house, she knew that the stability she had once taken for granted was gone forever. Striding up to the porch, Maria realized that she had lost everything: her family, her home, and the man who had once loved her. She had destroyed her life for her fantasy was now just a memory, and she was left with nothing but regret. 12 years had passed, and the life Elvis once knew had been completely transformed. The house that once echoed with the pain of betrayal now buzzed with laughter, love, and the hum of a family that had risen from the ashes. Elvis had become a well-known and respected figure in his industry. He'd rebuilt his life brick by brick. His children, Jake and Rose, had grown up to become extraordinary young adults. Jake, who'd once been a teenager consumed by anger and confusion, had channeled that energy into building his own business empire. He was just 27 when he did it. He was already a successful entrepreneur, known for his innovative ideas and relentless drive. His recent wedding had been a celebration of love, resilience, and new beginnings, attended by friends and family who had witnessed his incredible journey. Rose, who had been just a little girl when her mother walked out, was now a confident and driven young woman, excelling at college on her way to becoming a doctor, a dream she had nurtured for years. She was determined and compassionate, traits she had inherited from her father, who had been her rock through the darkest times, the scars of Maria's betrayal. Although the wounds were long since healed, they served as a reminder of the strength they had found in each other, in the life they had built together. The toxic presence of the past had no place in the home they had created. It was a home filled with warmth, support, and unconditional love. One evening, Elvis and Lisa, along with Jake Rose and their closest friends, attended a charity event in the city. The ballroom was elegant. It was an event celebrating community leaders and philanthropists. Elvis, now a pillar of his community, was one of the honoraries. As they moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and catching up, they felt proud of their achievements. With old friends, Elvis felt a sense of pride, not just in his professional achievements, but in the family he had nurtured and the life they had all worked so hard to create. Lisa, a woman who had brought so much love and stability into their lives, held his hand, their fingers intertwined, as a silent testament to the bond they shared. The bond they shared was suddenly interrupted when Elvis saw Maria across the room. She was looking gaunt and tired, her once vibrant beauty now faded by years of hardship and regret. Her clothes were worn, her hair lacked the shine it once had, and the confident air she had was gone. Maria looked like a shadow of her former self. It was clear that life had not been kind to her. Her eyes met Elvis's, and for a moment the world around them seemed to pause. She took a tentative step forward, her gaze pleading as if hoping to find some semblance of the life she once had. Maria had lost, but Elvis's expression remained unreadable. He seemed calm, detached, and indifferent, as if he felt no anger or sadness, only indifference. As Maria slowly approached, Elvis turned his attention back to his family. He gently guided Lisa and the children toward a group of friends, steering them away from the path Maria was taking. His movements were subtle and almost imperceptible to anyone. But Maria, who stood frozen, watched as the people she once called her family moved further and further away from her. The group found themselves at a table with old friends, and soon the air was filled with laughter and the warmth of shared memories. Elvis and Lisa were caught up in a conversation about their upcoming vacation plans, while Jake and Rose discussed their latest ventures. The group was glowing with excitement and pride, and it was a moment of pure contentment. Maria was standing on the sidelines, watching from afar. Maria's eyes filled with tears as she watched them. The joy on their faces, the love they shared, it was also painfully familiar yet completely out of reach. Maria had made her choice all those years ago, and now the consequences of her choice were laid bare before her. The family she had once taken for granted had moved on, grown stronger, and found happiness without her. In her desperate search for a better life, she had ended up with nothing. The tears began to fall freely, and Maria quickly turned away, not wanting anyone to see her in such a vulnerable state. She moved to the edge of the room. Away from the laughter and the light, she could wallow in her regrets and peace. She stood by a large window, staring out into the night. Her reflection faintly visible in the glass, the city lights sparkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped her life. For Elvis, the night continued without interruption. He was fully present with his family and friends. He didn't dwell on the past. He'd rebuilt his life with resilience and love, surrounded by people who mattered. As the evening drew to a close, the group decided to leave together. They strolled towards their cars, still chatting, and they laughed all the way home from the night's success. Elvis held Lisa's hand and felt a deep sense of peace. The pain of the past was finally behind him, and the future was bright. Maria watched them from a distance, standing in the shadows as they left. She was alone, forgotten by the people she had once abandoned. She was left to face the harsh reality of the life she had chosen. The fantasy she had destroyed was now nothing more than a memory, a painful reminder of what could have been. As Elvis and his family drove away, the world moved on without Maria. Left in the silence of her regrets, she had lost everything: her family, her home, and the man who had once loved her. Now she had nothing but the cold embrace of loneliness to keep her company.